You're not going to just be people who blindly do what they're told to do, but you're going to be a priestly kingdom, a holy nation. And that out of that relationship with me, that you're going to be a blessing to the world. You're not just going to barely make it and save yourselves. So the people are told what God's intentions are by Moses, and they say, yes, we will do this. We will do whatever God is inviting us to do. But the next thing that happens is that God is saying, okay, let's start preparing them to live with me in their midst. And so he talks to Moses and says, okay, get ready because I'm going to come down and I'm going to speak to you, but not only are you going to hear me, but all of the people are going to hear me. And from that point on, there's not going to be any doubt that I'm there in the midst of the community. And that sounds like a good plan. The problem is that once it finally starts happening, that God's intention of teaching them all how to hear his voice and all how to live in his presence, what happens when God's presence starts showing up? We're not really comfortable with this. Why don't we just go away, and instead of all of us hearing God's voice, let's just have you hear God's voice, Moses, and then just you tell us what to do. Doesn't that sound like slaves? You tell us what to do. We're not going to have our own relationship with God. Does that sound like that might be one of the issues with the church? Pastor, you tell us what to do. We're not going to read the Bible for ourselves or see what God's saying to us. But the whole invitation, I think that's where things start falling apart, is right there at the beginning. They're invited to live in a way that they all hear God's voice and they all experience God's presence. And instead they choose to just have some professional go and hear God for them and tell them what to do.
Our second reading is from Exodus chapter 33. When Moses is delayed on the mountains, the people assume he's dead, and they're on their own, so they convince Moses' brother Aaron to make a golden idol for them. God tells Moses what is happening in the camp, and says he'll destroy them and make a new nation of him. But Moses convinces God not to destroy the people. When he gets back to camp, he destroys the idol, reprimands his brother, and says it's time to move on from Mount Sinai. But who will travel with the people of Israel? An angel sent by God, or will God himself be in their midst? The Lord says to Moses, go, leave this place, you and the people whom you have brought up out of the land of Egypt, and go to the land of which I swore to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, saying, to your descendants I will give it. I will send an angel before you, and I will drive out the Canaanites, the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, and the Hivites, and the Jebusites. Go up to a land flowing with milk and honey, but I will not go up among you, or I would consume you on the way, for you are a stiff-necked people. Moses said to the Lord, see, you have said to me, bring up this people, but you have not let me know whom you will send with me. Yet you have said, I know you by name, and you have also found favor in my sight. Now if I have found favor in your sight, show me your ways, so that I may know you and find favor in your sight. Consider too that this nation is your people, he said. My presence will go with you, and I will give you rest. And he said to him, if your presence will not go, do not carry us up from here. For how shall it be known that I have found favor in your sight, I and your people, unless you go with us? In this way we shall be distinct, I and your people, from every other people on the face of the earth. The Lord said to Moses, I will do the very thing that you have asked, for you have found favor in my sight, and I know you by name. Moses said, show me your glory, I pray. And he said, I will make all my goodness pass before you, and will proclaim before you the name of the Lord. God renews the covenant with his people as they prepare to travel. God said, I hereby make a covenant. Before all your people I will perform marvels, such as have not been performed in all the earth or in any nation. And all the people among whom you live shall see the work of the Lord, for it is an awesome thing that I will do with you.
So they've just seen God come through with all these powerful plagues in Egypt. They've seen the waters parted, and now Moses is gone for a little while, and what do? Oh, maybe God's not real. Maybe we should just give up on this and we can do our own thing. Does that sound like you sometimes, that you go from this great high spiritual mountaintop experience, and all of a sudden, the next day, it's like, well, no, God hates me and God's not here. I think often that ends up happening, and that's what they're doing. You know what? Maybe this guy Moses was just misleading us. We need to do our own thing. We need to come up with our own gods. And this is actually, for me, one of the funniest. I mean, it's a bad story, but it's one of the funniest things in the Bible, because in this reading, Moses comes down from the mountain, and he asks Aaron what's going on, and Aaron says, oh yeah, we just collected some gold, we threw it in the fire, and out popped this calf. There's a little bit of humor in there. I think sometimes we come up with excuses, and we weren't really intentionally doing this, it just sort of popped out. But back to the story. Back to the story. God wanted to have them defined by his presence in their midst, but yet they didn't want to hear his voice. They wanted a special spiritual representative. And then Moses disappears for a while, and they start making their own gods. And we see a conversation between God and Moses, where God is saying, you know what, I'm going to downgrade my presence with you for the next stage of the journey. I'm not going to travel with you. I'm just going to send an angel to go ahead of you and help you get to where you need to go. And that's where I think God's testing Moses. Because is Moses going to accept that downgraded presence, or is Moses going to argue? And it's good that Moses argued, and I think that's what God wanted him to do. Moses says, no, time out, God. That's not the way it's supposed to work. We're the people who are not defined by having an angel go ahead of us. We're the people who are going to be known by your presence in our midst. So, God, if that's the way you're going to do it, I'm just going to sit here and I'm not even going to go to the next place unless you go with us. And I think God looks at Moses and says, good, I was hoping you would say that. So God is going to go ahead, not just an angel that will help them every once in a while, because that's who they're called to be. That they're going to be the ones who God will continue to show his power. And by the time they get to the border of the Promised Land, the reputation of this group of people with God traveling in their midst is going to have everybody thinking there's nobody like this nation of Israel. So we continue.
Our next reading is the book of Joshua, chapter 1. After the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord spoke to Joshua, son of Nun, Moses' assistant, saying, my servant Moses is dead. Now proceed to cross the Jordan, you and all this people, into the land that I am giving to them, to the Israelites. Every place that the sole of your foot will tread upon, I have given to you, as I promised to Moses. From the wilderness and the Lebanon as far as the great river, the river Euphrates, all of the land of the Hittites, to the great sea in the west shall be your territory. No one shall be able to stand against you all the days of your life. As I was with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not fail you or forsake you. Be strong and courageous, for you shall put this people in possession of the land that I swore to their ancestors to give them.
So Moses ends up dying before they get into the Promised Land. And you'd think normally you would find the most qualified leader, the most qualified military guide, or whoever who will lead you into the next stage of the journey. But if the whole point of them being God's people is that they hear God's voice and they value God's presence, what do you think is the most valuable characteristic that the next leader is going to need? Someone who's going to spend time in God's presence and hear God's voice. And if you read through that whole section in the Bible, you're going to see who is it that pretty much whenever Moses is in the presence of God, who's hanging out right with him? Joshua. Joshua was someone who also values the presence of God. Joshua is someone who has watched the way that Moses has this relationship with God. And so he's the logical choice to be the one who can take them the next step. And so now we see God calling him. And of course, these are some pretty big footsteps or shoes to step into with Moses. But yet, God says, as I was with Moses, so I will be with you. The challenges are going to be big ahead. And that's why he says several times, don't be afraid. And as I was reading through that this week, I thought, what do I do that actually puts me in a place where I depend upon God enough where he needs to tell me, don't be afraid? I think sometimes we end up just sort of going through the motions as Christians, and we just do things that we know we can accomplish on our own strength. But we don't actually allow God to call us into something that's bigger than us. And I think that's when you spend time in God's presence and hear what God's saying, that's going to happen sometimes, like with Joshua. The next stage of life you can't handle on your own resources. You're going to need to learn how to trust me, but I will be with you. So maybe you're at a place in your life right now where you can just keep on coasting, or maybe you're in a place where God's trying to get your attention to say, you know what? I'm going to call you into something that you might be afraid of. But don't worry. Don't be afraid. I'll be with you. And in the process, you're going to get to know things about me you wouldn't get to know if you just sort of lived a nice, safe life where you knew you could always do what was ahead of you. So, we continue with our reading.
Our final reading comes from the book of Joshua, chapter 6. One of Joshua's first tasks as a leader will be to bring the people through the Jordan River to the promised land. Just as Moses would part the Red Sea, the Jordan will be parted and the people will walk on dry land. They get in the land of promise, but they still need to trust God to take that land. Their first challenge will be the city of Jericho, and their means of defeating it will be awe. They will march around the city, yell and blow trumpets, and the walls will fall. This is God's victory, not a human victory. As soon as the people heard the sound of the trumpets, they raised a great shout, and the wall fell down flat. So the people charged straight ahead into the city and captured it. Then they devoted the destruction by the edge of the sword all in the city, both men and women, young and old, oxen, sheep, and donkeys. Joshua said to the 2 men who had spied out the land, "Go into the prostitutes' houses and bring the woman out of it, and all who belong to her, as you swore to her." So the young men who had been spies went in and brought Rahab out, along with her father, her mother, her brothers, and all who belonged to her. They brought all her kindred out and set them outside the camp of Israel.
Okay. So first, when you were growing up and you heard the story of the Exodus and the people of Israel in the wilderness, I always thought there was one water crossing. But when you read through the whole story, how many times did they go through the water? Twice. The first time is with Moses, when the Red Sea is parted and they pass from slavery to freedom. And who is it that parts the water? God. So God takes them from slavery to freedom. This part of the story is not with Moses, it's with Joshua. And the water they're crossing is not the Red Sea, it's the Jordan River. And it's not passing from slavery to freedom, but now they're passing from the wilderness into the promised land. And so as we look at even our own Christian symbolism of baptism, we have that water crossing that happens out of slavery to freedom. And we have that water crossing that we go from the wilderness of this life to the promised land. And it's interesting to see the guy who led them in that second water crossing is named Joshua, the one that leads them from the wilderness to the promised land. Who in the New Testament has the Hebrew name Joshua?
Jesus.
Jesus. So as we start to look at some of these things that are going to foreshadow what's going to happen in the future, that there's a new Joshua that's going to come, that's going to, through the waters of baptism, bring us from the wilderness of this life to the promised land. So they get into the land, and how did they get out of slavery? They trusted God's power. How did they get through the wilderness? Day by day, they trusted God's power to provide water and food, and each day they needed to depend upon God. So now they get into the promised land, and you'd think, okay, now everything's easy. They're in the promised land. All the inhabitants of the land will just hand over the keys and say, have a nice day. No. They're going to need to, even though they're in the promised land, they still need to trust God to take that land. And it's interesting to see some of the things that God does to make them continually conscious that it's not their own strength, but it's His strength that's going to take that land. So the first battle, the one that seems difficult, He makes it very clear that this isn't their strength that is going to accomplish the victory, by having them do some weird things. March around the city and blow trumpets and yell. I don't think that most people at West Point are going to be learning that strategy to win battles. So, but yet at the end of that preparation, and they're yelling and they're blowing trumpets, who wins the battle? God does. And it's very clear that it's not them, but it's God. But what is it that we're tempted to do when things go well, that God brings us into a victory? We start to think it's all about us. And so what do they do next? The very next place, it's like we've defeated this huge enemy, Jericho. And the next little town, Ai, is just down the road. We'll just send a few soldiers there to take it. And what ends up happening? They get routed, because who are they depending upon? Themselves. So as they go into these challenges, it will help them to move into the fullness of God's promise to them. They need to keep on trusting God, because whenever they try to move into the next part of God's promise on their own strength, they're going to discover that that's not going to work. So one interesting thing about this part of the story that gets us to start looking ahead to the New Testament part of the story is when they went into the land, they sent some spies to spy it out, and who did those spies stay with in Jericho?
Rahab.
A woman named Rahab, who was a prostitute. And so while they're there, they hear Rahab talking about how the reputation of the people of Israel is that the people are terrified, because they've just heard that this nation has God marching with them, and wherever they've gone, God's power has been displayed. So Rahab knows that Israel's going to defeat Jericho. She has that confidence. And so there's something about even a prostitute who has faith in the God of Israel is going to be brought into the story. Because at the end of that battle of Jericho, who is the only family that's saved? The family of Rahab. And where is Rahab going to show up later in the Bible story? She is going to be one of the descendants, or one of the, in the family line of Jesus. And we're going to see lots of interesting people that you wouldn't think would be the greatest people that you would choose to be in your ancestry. But yet, now it's going to be this faithful prostitute who is going to be part of the line that's going to end up bringing that new Joshua. So, as they get into the land, or just some things to think about, just to wrap up our reading for this week, and as you go and read these sections in the week ahead, is first, as Christians, sometimes I think that we define ourselves primarily by that Egypt to the Red Sea stage of the journey, but it's hard for us to move further. That we see ourselves primarily as servants who need to be told by someone what to do so that we don't get in trouble. And the invitation is that God didn't free us just to remain servants who are told what to do to not get in trouble. But God wants to keep on speaking into us and say, but if you really listen to me, then you're going to discover you're not a servant who needs to be afraid, but you are my treasured possession. You're a holy priesthood, a royal priesthood, a holy nation. And there's somehow during the Christian life that we need to learn that as we listen to God and trust God, that our whole identity is different. We're not just people trying to avoid making mistakes, but we're people who are being loved and encouraged and invested in so that we can be a blessing to our neighbor. And as we move forward, our identity is not that we follow the rules and do everything right, but our identity is that we are the people who experience God's presence and who look different because God's presence is at work in our lives. And as we move forward, we're not satisfied with just having God's resources show up every once in a while and send an angel to get us to the next stage. But that we, like Moses, are invited to say, God, unless you go with us, then we don't know who we are. Because we can't be who we're called to be if you just send an angel with us. We can only be who you call us to be when we understand that you're traveling with us. And as we allow God to lead us in the journey, He will put us in places that are bigger than us. That He will put us in places where we would say, God, I'm afraid. I don't know if I can do this. And God will say, as I was with Moses, I'll be with you. And you're going to discover that wherever I send you, you're going to be able to take that next territory. And you're going to discover my strength and my faithfulness along the way. So some things to think about as we look at how the story of Israel is meant to inform us in our walk in this week ahead.